Hi, Michelle Glass here. Welcome back to our final episode in Chapter 9. See, we're only doing a small little piece as promised. Our job for this video is to talk about actions. And these are the movements that we can produce in our body based on the articular surfaces of our synovial joints and the way the muscle is attached. So let's get started. So to begin, let's look at what are described as angular movements. And these are movements that can occur at hinge joints, condylar joints, saddle, and ball and socket joints. So our angular movements include what are described as flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Now these are movements that are in the anterior and the posterior direction, okay? Now our term flexion means to reduce the angle. So we're gonna reduce the angle. So if you're showing me your guns, you're reducing the angle there at your elbow. I can take my chin to my chest. That would be another example of flexion. Extension then is to make that angle bigger. So when I extend my forearm, then I'm widening the joint there at my elbow. And most of our joints are in extension in anatomical position. So my ears over my shoulder, my anatomical position here for my neck would be extension. If I have my arms down at the sides, then my elbow is in extension, okay? So pretty much everything except your ankles would be extended in anatomical position. Now hyperextension means to extend beyond anatomical position. So I can't do that with my joint, my elbow. The hinge joint opens and closes in just one direction, remember? But I can do that with my cervical vertebrae. So remember I did flexion, chin to chest. And extension is anatomical position, ears over shoulder. And then if I look up at the ceiling, that would be an example of hyperextension. So you can do that with your lower lumbar as well. So I can do a forward fold, which would be a flexion, so I disappeared. And then I can do a hyperextension as well. Okay, maybe if I went this way, that would be maybe more effective. Okay. All right, next we have what is called abduction and adduction. Now notice that the second letter is the only letter that's different. So sometimes I'll say abduction as opposed to adduction so that you're hearing the difference. Now these terms are only applied to your appendages. Abduction means to bring your appendage away from the midline, whereas adduction means to bring it in. I can do this with my finger. So I can have my abduction is to spread my fingers, and then adduction would be to bring them back in towards the midline. Now, this is not very effective with my arm up in the air in this direction because I really need it to be down in anatomical position. If I am standing in anatomical position and I spread my toes, that would be what? Abduction. And if I bring my toes back together, that would be adduction. Good job. Okay. Circumduction can only occur with the ball and socket joint, and that is making a complete circular motion there. Okay, next we're going to look at what are called rotational movements. Rotational movements can occur with a pivot joint and with a ball and socket joint. Okay, so we can do what is referred to as the medial and lateral rotation, or you can call it an internal and an external rotation. So if you take your left hand and you stick it up on your right humeral head, and you can feel the rotation, bring that in towards your midline, that would be medial or internal rotation, and then rotate it back and do the lateral or the external rotation there. And then we can also do left and right rotation. So I showed you that earlier when I said the C1 and the C2 allowed for the pivot allowed for the rotation movement, C1 and C2. So if I look over my left shoulder or look over my right shoulder, or I can turn my whole torso to the right or my torso to the left there, okay? Okay, next let's look at pronation and supination. These are specific to the forearm. So if you have your arm in anatomical position, you are in the supine position. If you take it palms down, that would be the pronation, or to pronate the hand there. You can use the memory device, and in the supine position, you can hold a bowl of soup in your hand. Okay, and then we have special type of movements. So we have a couple that are associated with the ankle. I'm not going to be able to get my feet on the camera, so I'm going to pretend with my hands here. So we have what's called inversion and eversion. So with inversion, you're going to be pointing the toes in towards the midline. With eversion, you're pointing them away from the midline, okay? Plantar flexion and dorsiflexion are also specific to the ankle. So if I am standing on tippy toes or pointing my toes down to the floor, I'm elevating my heel. That's called plantar flexion. So I like to say I'm going to plant my toes into the ground. If I do the opposite of that and ground my heel and lift up my toes, point them towards the ceiling, that's called dorsiflexion. We have the terms opposition and reposition that are specific to the thumb. So opposition is the ability to hold stuff, so to grasp my thumb across my hand. We've all heard the term the opposable thumb before, and so it's because it can do opposition. Reposition then would be to go back into anatomical position. Okay, and then protraction and retraction, you can do this with the mandible, you can do this with the head. So to protract means to go forward outside of anatomical position, and to retract is to bring it back into place, into anatomical position. You can do that with the mandible, so you can throw it out and bring it back into place. Depression and elevation. So you can do this with the rib cage, you can do this with the shoulder. So there are a few places. Let's do actually elevation first. So elevate, or bring your shoulders up to your ears. Depression would then be to pull them down away. When you take an inhale, you're elevating your rib cage. When you do an exhale, you're depressing your rib cage. So we'll talk about that again in part 2 when we're looking at the respiratory system. Okay, and then lateral flexion. Remember we said flexion was reduction of the angle, but lateral flexion would be to the side. So you can do this with your vertebral column. So we can take our right ear to our right shoulder. Notice how that's different from looking over your right shoulder, which would be rotation. Left ear to left shoulder, different again from rotation. And you can do that with your lower lumbar as well. Okay. Okay, that's it for chapter 9.